Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. We're almost down to the wire.
Extraterritorial stuff from our solicitors. Carla?
No. It was. Do we have enough chairs? So it was once observed by Abraham Lincoln that in law it is a good policy to never plead what you need not, lest you oblige yourself to prove what you cannot. Today, I think we will see the law applied wisely and sagely by our panel as we debate, perhaps, consider, and probe at a number of the questions that have arisen about the legal considerations surrounding maritime cultural landscapes. We have quite the distinguished panel. I'll start with Caroline Blanco. Caroline is an Assistant General Counsel for the Environment at the National Science Foundation, where she provides advice on environmental and cultural resource laws that are implicated by the Foundation's mission in promoting cutting-edge science and technology. Prior to assuming her current position, she served as a trial attorney in the Natural Resources Section of the Environment and Natural Resources Division of the U.S. Department of Justice, where from 1991 until 2007 she specialized in public lands law, heritage resources law, and in particular historic shipwreck litigation. Ms. Blanco, twice a recipient of the Attorney General's Award for Distinguished Service, frequently lectures in the field of heritage resources law at law schools and government training seminars throughout the country. In addition, she has co-authored several books and articles on cultural property law and serves as an adjunct faculty member of American University's Washington College of Law, where she teaches a course on cultural property law. Prior to her government service, Ms. Blanco was a litigation associate at the famous law firm of McCutcheon, Dole, Brown & Anderson, San Jose, California. Yeah. Famous. God bless Wikipedia. Chip Brown. Chip is the Government Assistance and Training Specialist in the Wisconsin Office of the State Historic Preservation Officer. He's worked for the Wisconsin Historical Society for over 20 years. Chip is an attorney licensed to practice law in the state of Wisconsin and the Federal District Court for the Seventh Circuit. Chip completed his undergraduate work in anthropology, specializing in archaeology, focusing on non-human faunal remains. He conducted field work in Somalia, Africa. Chip has provided lectures, workshops, and other training programs on federal and state historic preservation and human burial site preservation laws and processes. He developed the Washington NHPA Section 106 and State Agency Local Unit of Government Submittal and review processes to streamline project reviews applicable to federal and state agency and local unit of government actions in Wisconsin. Chip also coordinated the restructuring of the state burial preservation program. Chip conducts federal and state historic preservation and human burial disturbance regulatory review and negotiates and drafts programmatic agreements between the SHPO and federal and state agencies. He was a member of the team that drafted the first NRCS nationwide PA. He works with the Wisconsin Department of Justice on historic preservation and human burial law-related matters that require formal adjudication and other formal resolution. Paul, you've got like the shortest one here. Paul Loether needs no introduction. He is the chief.
Move on.
He is the chief of the NPS National Register, National Historic Landmark Program, and deputy keeper of the National Register, the former SHPO of Connecticut, and here Barbara said he'll have to fill in the rest. Jessica Perkins. Jess grew up in rural Rhode Island and obtained her BA in sociology with honors from the University of New Hampshire. Jess received her Juris Doctorate with a certificate in natural resources and environmental law with a specific focus on American Indian law from Lewis and Clark Law School. Awesome. My best friends went to Lewis and Clark. They're now recovering lawyers. After law school, Jess worked 11 years at the Sitka tribe of Alaska, serving as Realty Officer, Resources Protection Director, and Tribal Attorney. During this time, Jess spent many hours researching and pursuing Tlingit land claims through the Sitka area. She married the son of a Tlingit clan leader and became a member of the Kiksati clan. Wow, almost got it. After a short stint away from Sitka, Jess recently returned to work at Sitka National Historical Park, which was created to commemorate two important pieces of Sitka's history, the 1804 Tlingit Russian battleground and the 1843 Russian Bishop's House. Dave Thulman. Dave, that's a short one too. All right. Dave Thulman received his JD from George Washington University and his PhD in anthropology from Florida State University. He's been an attorney for the Florida Environmental Agency for over 30 years, focusing on, among other things, natural resource protection and damage assessment, He also works as an archaeologist excavating prehistoric underwater sites in Florida and teaches at George Washington University. At last-
You're not going to read mine, are you?
Well, it's not listed here, actually, so I have to wing it.
Wing it. There you
So, Ola Varmer is an attorney in the international section of NOAA's Office of General Counsel. Ola is no stranger to people who know historic shipwreck issues and litigation, having been involved in a variety of cases, including, notably, RMS Titanic, but a variety of other cases. Winner of far too many awards to list back at NOAA for his diligence and his work, Ola is perhaps also best known for his lead guitar and excellent licks, as also, I should say, lead singer for the band Three Drink Minimum. Ladies and gentlemen, your panel.
So who's in charge?
Hi, Jim. Aren't you going to
We need moderators.
Oh, yeah. That's right. No presentations. I'll ask questions.
Really, I was just going to do the usual trick, which was to ask the panel, how was copper wire invented, and then toss this amongst a group of lawyers. Sorry, just one cheap shot. So, esteemed panel members, I think the best way to pursue this is to have a brief statement from each of you. I think each and every one of you has considered a bit of what's been said over the past couple of days, has some specific thoughts, and I think that as you start with your brief introductory statements, you will certainly inspire response from each other. Ola, I'm going to start with you.
Oh, okay. So, first of all, I really thank you for the invitation. This has been very interesting. I knew a little bit about maritime cultural landscapes because of Jim, and I've learned a lot. And I really appreciate a lot of the presentations, but I really want to call out Tricia from Hawaii because she did what you all should do. That's my short message on maritime cultural landscape is just do it. And that's the way to do it. That's the model that she presented. I thought it was brilliant and inspirational. The first time I came up with this approach was working on the nomination for Papana Mokukea for the World Heritage. And we were putting it in as actually I should say the state of Hawaii was the lead. And they wanted it as a mixed site, both natural and cultural. And I don't know anything about the World Heritage process, but IUCN is a technical advisor for natural, ICOMOS is a technical advisor for the cultural. And we put in our nomination, led by the state. IUCN came back and said, this is fantastic. It meets every criteria that you have suggested. This is a home run. This is a no-brainer. You don't really need to do anything else. On the cultural side, this is kind of weak. You're having trouble. You really should consider the landscape approach. And immediately started Googling what the landscape approach was. I'd never heard of it, didn't know it. I learned about, how this, I was happy to hear that it started with a Swede, Scandinavia. And we learned a lot about it, and we revised the application, and we were successful. And one of the key things that made us a success, because frankly the shipwrecks wouldn't meet the criteria, and we had some terrestrial sites, but what we did in the cultural section was explain that to the native Hawaiian people, the coral is the beginning of life. It is where life comes from. And when you die, it is where you go back. And protecting the coral is not just protecting natural heritage, it's protecting a cultural heritage. And we explained how now they're starting these practices of thousands of years of going out, how now it's a living cultural site, and getting them to realize that it was really the cultural heritage at Papahana Mokukea that was the coral. And they agreed, and it was the first site in the U.S. that's on, they have a World Heritage, We have a natural site, a cultural site, and a much smaller list of those few places that meet both natural and cultural. And it's the only U.S. site on the register of that inscription. I have other points I want to bring up, but I don't want to take up all the time. I want to tell that little story first and thank Tricia.
So in the best tradition of Ola's band, does anybody want to play their own solo or riff?
I'll give it a shot. Just a couple of things. First of all, I want to remind everybody with respect to the National Register that there was a lot of discussion, or some discussion in the session about, contributing and non-contributing lists. The contributing, non-contributing really derived out of the tax credit program. Everything within the boundary of a National Register property technically is listed in the register. And that's beneficial for a number of reasons. Number one, in 106, if you're doing it as an SHPO, you can review anything. It's not just what's in the nomination. Number two, it affords the ability to consider features which are not specifically enumerated in that contributing list. And I would strongly recommend that when you approach reviewing National Register nominations, particularly ones that are already done, start with Section 8. Don't start with the list. The list is not unimportant, but Section 8 sets the stage for what's significant. And if you're dealing with cultural landscapes, say, that are in a district format, you will pick up the significance of those landscape features if those nominations are well written. You'll pick them up right at the beginning. And I think that's critical when you're getting into resource management. And the third thing is that National Register is not the end. It's one tool in the toolbox. And we need to make sure that our constituents continue to understand that. As most of you know, 106 is not a guaranteed result. It's a process, and people forget that. Traditional cultural properties are often looked at as a magic bullet. They're not. It's not to denigrate the value of any of this. It just has limitations, and those limitations apply not only in the practitioner aspects, but also the legal aspects.
David.
I have a few observations. So I am not a federal government attorney, and so I can't lose my job, I guess, depending on what I say. I was invited by Mike Russo, and just like Ken Sassaman, I said, yeah, this sounds great. What's an MCL? And I've learned a lot in the readings beforehand, and certainly a lot listening to what's been said today. So I have three general observations going forward. And I am an agency attorney for a long time, so I understand sort of the need to interpret statutes and make them usable on the ground. So I come to this with sort of how are these going to be managed? And it wasn't really until Susan Dolan's talk about an hour ago that I finally saw, I can see now how you can get beyond the artifact and sort of manage the landscape. But that's the first time I've heard that, and it was absolutely unclear to me beforehand how that might be. It does seem to me that this notion of MCL is very valuable for research context. So archaeological research, framing historical research, it's unclear to me how it's helpful in a management setting. And by that I mean I'm unclear as to how the tools that are available right now wouldn't do the job that needs to be done without overlaying this other layer of complexity on the issue. I talked to Mike Russo a little bit last night about it, and it does seem like there are a couple of situations having to do with salvage where this notion of MCL would be helpful and would fill a gap. But it might be that its use should be perhaps limited to that purpose, just so that it doesn't overlay this extra complexity. I would guess that if we were all asked to pull out a piece of paper and write down what is an MCL in a paragraph or less, there wouldn't be a consensus about what that is. And so, to me, as an outsider, I'd say the concept definitely needs boundaries and definitions so that it becomes usable for both the managers and people who want to get properties listed. Second observation I'd make has to do with shipwrecks, and I'm an underwater archaeologist. I have hundreds of hours excavating. 12 minutes of those are bottom time on a ship. So it's all prehistoric in Florida, by and large. And it does seem like there is a definite bias in favor of shipwrecks and historical resources. And I'm not sure why that is. I know that there are not a lot of prehistoric archaeologists out there, although I have met two recovering environmental lawyers who are now archaeologists. Besides myself, that's three that I know now. I thought I was alone in that. But to me, and this is not going to make a lot of people happy, I don't think, but I conceptualize a shipwreck is basically a complicated, isolated artifact out of context, much like a projectile point. So I'm interested in the time period of about 11,000 to 14,000 years ago, definitely pre-contact. And if I were snorkeling and surveying off Cape Hatteras and I came across a projectile point lying on the sand, say it's right next to a shipwreck, I would do everything that a shipwreck archaeologist would do with that point. So I would measure its stem to stern, I'd take the beam, I'd see how much tonnage it is. That's as far as I can get out on the metaphors there, but I take the width, I figure out how it was made, where the material came from, what its use life was, how it changed through its use. I put it in a temporal context, I put it in its typology, I determine how it's different from other members of its class. I create a story about who made it and where it came from and what its use life was. Only thing I'm missing is a name for that person. And that may have been dropped from a boat, it may have been dropped in a context in which the land was dry. But if I were to nominate that projectile point for the register, I think I'd get immediately trashed. But if I were to nominate a historic shipwreck, which is an isolated out of context artifact, it would at least come under consideration, it seems to me. The last point I'd make is this, is that as an environmental agency lawyer and now an archaeologist, although both these groups have cultural or resource management in their name, they definitely see the same world in different ways. So that environmental managers are interested in protecting the underwater environment, especially in wetlands and submerged situations. Archaeologists are interested in the archaeology of it. But at least under the state of Florida law, and I think under federal law, when those two come into conflict, the environmental laws always trump. So the notion of preservation of a submerged cultural resource gets sort of turned on its head. Really what you're doing, since you're not going to put preservative on the shipwreck and you're not going to chip off the coral, that you're really managing the destruction of it. And so although there's been talk about there ought to be continuity between the land and the sea, the actual management of these resources is going to be very different. So that's all I'd say. It's a long-winded way of saying I'm done.
I guess I'll go. I come from the same school of thought as Ola, is just do it. I mean, it strikes me that I was pouring through some of the regulations over the last day or two, trying to figure out what is the problem. Isn't it all here? And I think it is. I think that, it's easily defensible if it meets the criteria and everything else that you would normally need for a National Register nomination. Water is not a distinction, whether it's below water or above water. If you look through all of the bulletins, you'll see numerous numerous references to things being underwater or in water. A shipwreck's given as an example. And so I think we're getting into some trouble with words. And one of the things that strikes me as particularly interesting, I've heard some of the presentations today where they talked about land, and land is problematic. I don't see that as a problem because Submerged Lands Act exists, right? And so just because something is underwater, it doesn't make it not land. It still is land. So I think maybe we need to think a little bit broader about things. And it has always been, since I started at Justice in '91, I remembered there was always this concern about, you know, if it's on land, people understand it. If it's underwater, people don't understand that that's something to protect. And I've seen a tremendous amount of progress over the decades, you know, to see that that's changed in terms of awareness quite a bit. But I would say definitely just go for it, because the regulations are there to support you. And there's no reason to make a distinction just because something's underwater, or, you know, that there's a relationship to it. So if there is a landscape, whether that means submerged lands or a combination of terrestrial and underwater lands, I think that the law is there to support it. And another thing I heard was that boundaries were an issue. Well, if you look through some of the bulletins, it says boundaries an issue regardless if it's underwater. It doesn't say regardless of underwater, but it talks about on land that it's an issue. I think what you just have to do is take a look at what is the connection, why is it significant, and use the regulations to support that. And one example I was thinking about is that I'm now at the National Science Foundation, and if I were to advise my clients about how to do 106, if there was what we've been kind of talking about as a maritime cultural landscape, and I would say maritime is a subset of cultural in a sense. So we just look at, again, with the words, we're kind of making it more difficult on ourselves. But if there is something to be said about a cultural landscape within an area of potential effects, I would say it doesn't matter if it's underwater in part or in whole. It still is a cultural landscape. And you need to do 106, and if you don't, then you're violating the law. So think about it from another way of, would you have to do 106 on it? So just my thoughts.
So being an attorney here from Wisconsin, in the office of the SHPO, we have been talking about what our new marine sanctuary means to us. How are we going to enforce anything that comes down in the management plan, et cetera? A lot of the questions that I've actually heard from folks and posed through talks the last couple of days. And I'd like to back up a moment and say thank you very much. I'm honored to be here. This group of people is incredible, and this is something I think that does not happen very often, and I do believe this is a very important gathering, and so again, I'm honored to be part of this, so thanks. But over the last couple of days, listening and being amazed by the stories that people have been telling across the board, I find myself thinking that I'm a little fearful, being an attorney working in the office of the SHPO, that people are looking to us to answer the questions of how do we preserve and how do we protect, and we've got all this great stuff out here that we're sharing with you, but we don't know what to do with it, and you guys are now going to do that. And so, I almost wore my attorney hat and coat when I came up here to say, okay, I'll answer those questions, but really, I think, like many of you, we're kind of moving forward as you are and looking at the complexity of what things mean in terms of what is the preservation and the protection. In Wisconsin, we've certainly got 106. We've got the federal law that we can use. Thankfully, we don't have any international boundaries, so we don't have to deal with those issues. Not even in Lake Superior. We border Minnesota and Michigan. It comes to a point up there. No Canadian border, so we're good. We have many, many state and local laws, local ordinances. We have a human burial sites preservation law. All of these laws are in competition with each other. Sometimes they cancel each other out. Sometimes they don't. With respect to the marine sanctuary that we have, the Wisconsin-Michigan Sanctuary, it's not entirely clear to me how these laws are going to play out, whether or not 106 will apply in every case. We don't have the plan together. We still have public comment to take. We still have to put in place what the regulations are going to be that pertain to the sanctuary. And so all of these things are kind of juggled up in the air, and we're looking at how that's going to pan out. And we'll see over the next couple of months. But I would say that we are excited by the process. I think we're, the 15th sanctuary, and so I think there is an incredible opportunity here to see what this does mean from the historic preservation perspective. There are landscape opportunities, things that we don't necessarily consider when we're looking at the typical work that we see. You know, we'll look at 1,500 projects in a given year, thousands of pieces of correspondence with regard to all of those, but this is something special. And I think it's something that has application for us as we move forward. Numerous maritime resources in the state, thousands of miles of coastline, whether it's riverine, the Great Lakes, smaller lakes. Minnesota's the land of 1,000 lakes. We've got a few thousand lakes here, but you know, we don't brag about that. But anyway, we have that. So we are a maritime, marine state. There is no getting around that. And we certainly do need to look at what that has meant for the last 15,000 years. We have 11 federally recognized tribes here in the state of Wisconsin, all of whom have, in my mind, excellent relationships with the SHPO, which is a tremendous thing, because those folks will be involved in what happens with this marine sanctuary, what happens every day with the work that we do in the office of the SHPO. And so we're looking forward again to solving whatever issues come up, and I'm looking forward today to hearing what you have to ask us. I mean, here we've got 6 attorneys up here, and each of us will have a different idea as to how to answer the questions you ask. But I think it's an exciting time, and so again, thank you.
So I guess last, I have lots and lots of thoughts, but I'm going to keep them really small for you guys. I feel like, you know, it's hard for me to see, you know, I hear people talk about application, I hear people talk about research and management, and it's all about, you know, a place and a land and a piece of, like, you know, site-based, you know, and you get the categories and the property types. And I think about that, and it just, the maritime cultural landscape, on paper, the words, like everyone says, you know, it means something different to everybody, sounds like a really great idea for, you know, a conservation and sort of a bigger approach to things. But as we're all kind of talking through, NHPA already has these very specific things. And I still, you know, I sound like a broken record, or I feel like a broken record. It still feels like a bad fit. So I think about Alaska tribes, and I think about the way Congress decided to work with them and create native corporations, and that we don't have reservations, yet NHPA talks about tribal land as only being within a reservation or a dependent Indian community. Well, if you have 25% of your population as native, is that really a dependent Indian community? So I feel like the MCL stuff, to me, still, you know, we're still within the National Register, we're still within NHPA. It still poses, in my mind, the same challenges that we did, that we had before I walked in the door.
Roland.
To try to build on what's being said here, and thinking about, you know, how I advise my program, you know, the sanctuary program, and I guess I'm being taped, so we'll talk it in general terms, because I'm actually not the sanctuary, I do international now. But the way I see the marine cultural landscapes playing out, and to a certain extent, I think I have done it. I think the Florida Keys plan that we didn't really use those terms, but we did what I was talking about, what Tricia did. We tried to layer back. Here's this natural environment, and here's how it's been impacted by humans over time. And from prehistoric times, we may find some resources here. You know, we'll identify, you know, we have these 110 responsibilities, and so we identified the shipwrecks that we thought, we're in the sanctuary based on literature and frankly the Florida archives and some MMS data. But this is where I think MCL comes in NHPA 110 responsibilities. You know, what you're trying to do is show how everything's connected. Show how, you know, in this space that we're going to have management alternatives, we need some baseline information about the natural, the cultural, and explain how the natural may be cultural to some of the people that live in this area, going to be impacted. And it shouldn't be just in the context of the National Register. This should be in the context of the National Environmental Policy Act. This is the kind of thing that, I think when they enacted NEPA, they were hoping we would be doing. What's your environment, and how's it going to be affected by your plan? And remember, humans are part of the environment, and you need to think about, the prehistoric times, the history, and current practices, and come up with management alternatives that are sensitive, where you consult. And how can you do that if you haven't done the maritime cultural landscape? To me, is frankly reorganizing the information that we've been talking about in a way that shows better connections. I think Val did it first, and others talked about it. We've gone from species management to now we want to do ecosystem management. Well, and this is very similar to that. And Tricia brought in the watershed management, because frankly, if you've got a watershed and you've got people, you know where the sites are going to be, or you at least have a predictability model. And that can be so important, and explaining it in that way will help. So when you get into the 106 situation, you have a better handle on who you should be consulting with. And if you were lucky, maybe they even gave you some information that you could put into your GIS and you have it up front. But if not, at least you know who you're going to need to consult with and what you might be up against. And that's how, and it can be all the way up from the mountains and all the way out to that part of the shelf that at once was a coastline, because that's, where there's a coastline and there's people, there's going to be some evidence, remnants there at some point. And then, I think maybe it is big. But you can use that as your plan for complying with 110 and saying, okay, well, this is what we got to manage, and and this is what we know about, and maybe we should list this site on the register, and maybe you have a collection that can be a district, and maybe you even have a big district. But I don't think you have to redo anything at the register in order to accomplish those objectives that you want to do now.
Well, it's an interesting point. Just to throw something into the mix. I mean, as policy person for the national system, the way I've been looking at this is not necessarily that we have to come up with National Register nominations for maritime cultural landscapes that cover the boundary of every national marine sanctuary. Rather, it strikes me more and more that it's a theoretical construct that has tremendous applicability to process, and that process is, at its simplest, consultation and connectivity. That it's taking a view that is non-hierarchical, which is an interesting point, given that we talk about levels of significance. What I like about the maritime cultural landscape is that it lays it out, and it doesn't impose. Though there are layers there, it doesn't actually in its own way impose. Traditional names passed on from the ancestors in the ancient times are there. The names of the colonizers are there. We can all assign our value judgment to that, but the simple fact is that nothing is, in this approach, ideally is not erased. It's there. That respect is given to, in particular, voices that have previously not been heard. I mean, I grew up in an area that, you had a later name applied. When I was in my museum in Vancouver, I was very clear. I was in the traditional lands of the Tsleil-Waututh, as well as their Musqueam cousins, at Sunok, on the shores of something called Burrard Inlet, which had previously been El Canal de Rosario, because different folks had come through and placed their names on it. Landscape approach laid it all out. But in that approach also, it was pretty clear who was there first and how other things had come along. So I like what I see with MCLs. My concerns or issues as a policy person legally are making sure that I can use these constructs, in some cases, frankly, to ensure that my own agency and my own people do right and don't overlook resources that hitherto perhaps have not been seen in the way they should be seen if you apply the MCL construct, and as well that whatever I do to protect that is enforceable under the law. So.
And I think you raised a point about level of significance. We like to think that there's levels of significance, but there's also layers, and the layers are not necessarily levels. when I showed the stuff about whether it's Nantucket, the islands, there are at least two cultural landscapes there. There's the indigenous landscape where the tribes that are there as native peoples look at it. They just don't look at the wonderful houses and the docks and the piers, all the recreational stuff that grew up there, for which it is also significant. They don't look at it the same way. They don't deny the existence of it. They simply look through that layer to another layer. Same is true with the recent decision we made on Jamestown and the James River. There is, while we didn't go into it in detail, I'm persuaded from the information I've seen, there's clearly an indigenous cultural landscape, maritime, but there's also a post-contact level of a layer of significance from a maritime cultural landscape. Smith Island, all those, Holland Island, which is no longer an island, it's gone. But, I mean, those kinds of things, we need to understand that the complexity is multi-layered. And that, you're right, I don't think we can afford to leave out anybody.
It's your turn. John Jensen. Well, anybody got the mic for John?
I also have a quarterback voice, Joe.
Hey, well done.
Go for it.
Well, this is for the people streaming.
I was really interested on, I think it was David's initial comment about sort of the, science or, natural resources people think this way, cultural resources people think that way, and that's true enough to an extent, but here we are in a place talking about maritime coastal landscape, cultural landscapes or cultural things. One of the things that's driving this is the fact that climate change, economic development, there's a whole host of things that are forcing us to think more critically about what's going on in this coastal zone from land to the end of the continental shelf, which suggests that we're looking for new answers, and it's a new generation. And so one of the things as leaders that we can do is think about the fact that this binning off hasn't worked particularly well, or that doesn't work particularly well now. One of the elements with cultural landscape is it fits into the word landscape. There's a whole set of initiatives, and I'm not as up on them as I should be, on developing ecological landscapes approaches within NOAA and other places of the federal government. And so by thinking about cultural landscapes in these terms, we can, again, start to build the language, but also try to break down these bins between artificially distinctive categories at a time when again, where the pressure is there for us to create. We create new solutions when we are faced with problems or opportunities, and we're in that spot right now, and I think we really need to do that. And so, again, thinking about how we can move forward, recognizing these connections between natural and cultural, and recognize there's other stuff that's going on with the government. We can't afford to put this all in just historic preservation terms. And so, a lot of leaders here, and that is something that can come out of this.
Hans. Sorry, John, we got to do the baton pass on.
Thank you for the comment on the shipwreck bias. I'm trained in maritime history and shipwreck archaeology, and I agree 100%. I love these pictures. I don't think I've seen a single non-ship picture yet scrolling past us. But I come from a state that is dedicated to showing us that, there's so much more. And the term that you used, that we're managing the destruction, brilliant. When we took on the annex as a kind of a best management practice, of course not signing the UNESCO convention itself, we agreed to in situ preservation and then had to scratch our heads and think, well, what does that really mean? And I think what in situ preservation has come to mean is that we're just trying to minimize intentional damage as the stuff falls apart anyway. Everything's going to fall apart. That raises just a naive question for me, and I ask a lot of naive questions, so my apologies. What is the implication of the definitions of damage to properties for shipwrecks that are taken on by an agency with the intention to protect these things? Federal agencies, which tend to say they're going to do that in perpetuity. you know, we're just trying to prevent anchor damage and looting. But if we nominate these sites, or if they're eligible, and they're within our boundaries, and they're obviously important to us, when you say that neglect of a property is a type of damage, there's no way that we're going to be out there and proactive and do real in situ preservation, meaning geotextiles or on-site storage for the tens and hundreds of shipwrecks that we're taking on. What's the real implication there of damage through neglect?
I would say that my answer to that would be there's proactive neglect in a sense, where you're just not going to do anything. And the rest is, you're right, it's trying to arrest the rate of deterioration at its best. And you can do some, with some resources, certainly if you pay attention to them, you can do a measure of restorative work. Of course, the restorative work itself sometimes is not historic anymore. I'm thinking something like the Constitution. Over time, it's got historic repairs and less historic repairs. The ship is still there, visible and tangible. How much of its original fabric? I don't know, under 15%?
About 12,
yeah.
actually.
So, yeah, you're right. I mean, the nature of preservation is that things that we make fall apart eventually. But I think the intention is to arrest that process to the degree possible and certainly prevent it from proactive neglect, where you're not bothering to try to do anything to not only arrest it, but also to stop active damage that could be prevented. So you're right. I mean, that's the nature of our business. We can't save everything, and at the end of the day, we probably can't save anything forever. But nonetheless, we try.
But having said that, I think, again, embracing this concept as a theoretical, moving into management, I don't think we can apply even, you know, benign neglect when it comes to engaging with people and hearing voices that speak to important aspects like biocultural resources that bring to the forefront things that, you know, perhaps do require more than just sitting there. I mean, in terms of active consultation and understanding, things like the work that's been done to understand tribal perspectives and indigenous perspectives in the landscape, and having that voice and that perspective there, and a respected sovereign voice at that. So, I mean, that makes me think that I'm actually doing my job and upholding the law if I embrace that as a management concept and carry it forward.
Yeah, I would say from Wisconsin, here where I am, there is an analogy. There are, as many of you know, or all of you know, huge mound complexes here, effigy mounds, other mounds, pretty unique to the upper Midwest. Processes are in place through which those mounds are eroding. They are being diminished in size. Natural processes. And when we speak to the Ho-Chunk people, the Potawatomi, the Menominee, folks who have established connection to these mounds and these kinds of sites, the issue, it seems to me, always is one of we don't impede the natural process. And so you look at a shipwreck or something else that has gone down. What are we trying to do? Do we want to pull these out of the water and go through all of the scientific necessities to preserve these forever? Well, there might be one or two, because of their extraordinary significance, that we might try to slow down the processes through which they are decaying. But in my mind, the work that we do is to not accelerate the process, not allow that acceleration to happen by virtue of ignorance or people doing things to contribute to the destruction of sites. It's to ensure, perhaps, the natural processes themselves are able to continue unimpeded in the way they should. And so I think that there is something to be said for that.
I have something to add to that. I think that if you think about a historic property above the ground, they repaint it all the time. They pull the vines off. They mow the grass. You know, they trim it up. They want to preserve it at a particular place in time. It's a cultural artifact within a sort of a biological setting. But when you're talking about a shipwreck or some other cultural property underwater, you're really talking about a biocultural artifact. It's a melding of biology and culture which you cannot really separate. and that's just going to lead to this eventual destruction. But it's a totally different entity than the historical property that's above the water. And in that context, you're constantly fighting termites and other biotic agents that are aimed at destruction. But once you get below the surface, it's an entirely different story.
Just on that point, though, I mean, I think, again, coming from the NOAA perspective and also having heard people, for me, a biocultural resource is also, it's herring, it's orca, it's the white shark. It's
Away from the maritime setting, it's cattle and cowboys on the Green River Drift.
To me, this is a fascinating discussion. I know that someday Keith Richards is going to die.
I don't think so. I think he made a deal with the devil.
It could be.
He's a very good case of preservation.
No, but the painting of him looks really young.
Everyone else is catching up is all that's happening.
I could be wrong. I mean, he might be around much longer, but he exists in virtual form, right? We have recordings, and the Rolling Stones will live forever, I hope.
That's
and
right.
And so I'm an archaeologist, and when we do mitigative action, we're creatively destroying it. When we mitigate a site, get it out of the way of a development project or something like that, we're converting it from a material resource into an information source.
Right.
We certainly curate the artifacts. We have dilemmas over what gets curated, what doesn't, what can we de-accession, how much firecracked rock are we going to keep laying around. But my point is, I think Shannon Lee Doughty did a nice piece a while back, very controversial, that archaeologists ought to be getting out of the heritage business and thinking about futures. And the process of ruination is critical here, that ruination, allowing processes to unfold as they would had humans not intervened, is essential to accepting that change is a part of the world before you, that trying to stop the world or trying to prevent things from evolving into other states and becoming, in fact, disintegrating into nothingness or whatever, existing only in virtual form, is part of our ability as people to see that there'll be a future that's different than the present, right? And I know that that's the basis for capitalism, that every future is different than every past, and that's a problem itself. But I think this cuts to a real theoretical issue of why we even do what we do, historical, archaeological, preservation-wise. And I don't have an answer here. I think I'm just throwing out. I think this is a really, really critical, interesting question. And again, I would come back to the point that we're doing it for futures, not to stop the past in the present, but to move forward. And I don't think that it's worth our effort, time, money to dump a whole bunch of resource into stopping time.
Well, to that end, though, too, I mean, if we are working with traditional cultures and indigenous peoples, are we not then working towards the future in the right way, infusing what we do with traditional knowledge and respect for those traditions?
Yeah, it's like the same point you made about the shipwrecks, when we worked on that recovery for the Seminole tribe. They were perfectly fine with those barrels washing into the Gulf of Mexico as long as humans didn't intervene in that process. When polluting ensued, that's when we had to do the mitigative work on that. They don't see that as disappearing. No. They just see it being transformed.
Yeah.
So it's Chris McMasters with Battlefields, and feeling a little lonely because we actually do think of perpetuity, and we do think of long-term preservation. That might be why Barbara put me in that session, because we have tools for long-term preservation, and we, with our grants that I talked about today, are looking at perpetual care and encouragement. We have another grant I didn't talk too much about, which is the Battlefield Land Acquisition Grants, which purchases or puts easements on battlefields. And the idea is to freeze frame them. I mean, the idea is to freeze them in place and to find stewards who will keep them for as long as possible. So we're almost fighting benign neglect. And we set up a mechanism that's even higher than 106. It's based in the Land and Water Conservation Act, so that if someone wants to do a 106, they really can't without the approval of the Secretary of Interior. So once we buy that, it's sort of like a land trust. And it would be kind of nice to hear more about the possibility of land trust activities in an underwater session, in an underwater sort of way. Is there anybody out there who'd ever think about that as an option for more permanent care? And is there groups out there who would even think along those lines of holding land in that way like the Archaeology Conservancy does?
I think one of the inherent issues with that is that most people that care about the oceans as an entity and about that which lives in it, and about issues like the acidification and sea level rise and warming. What I like about this concept, and frankly what I think my bosses like about this concept, is that it reintroduces something in Western culture we often set aside, which is the human element. We can be too scientistic or we can be too legalistic, and we forget those ties, those powerful ties, which our ancestors certainly had and which certain cultures still do have. So that's where I come back to it. Is the issue really trying to create a boundary, be it a National Register district or a park or a sanctuary, or is it to embrace that which is out there, which is neither cultural nor natural, but both? So I'm just tossing that out. Of course, I'm always happy to see areas of the ocean set aside. And I think we have legal mechanisms to do that. In terms of purchasing them, though, in terms of trust, that'd be a tough one other than, say, shipwrecks. And I'd like to see us try to steer away a little bit from shipwrecks and get back to the bigger issue. So, any thoughts or comments on that? There was a question in the back, JJ? Sam?
There are more resources than just shipwrecks.
Absolutely.
I mean, and Doug was talking about it before, you know, when you start to move out, what do you find that's below the surface that talks about human habitation? Now, they did Cape Wind, they dropped 3/4 and 32 square miles. They didn't find them, except Ecofacts, which corroborated all of the oral traditions that the tribes were talking about inhabiting horseshoe shoals, which, of course, before the inundation would have still been a mound. It's only about 12 feet deep out there.
Right.
And that's, I think, for me, that's the concern. I mean, I love ships. You know this.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. But the bottom line is there's probably a whole lot more. Now, I also know, for example, if the seabed is anything like New England everywhere else, the soils are so acidic that not a whole lot survives that's not in terms of natural materials other than stone.
Right.
And then you've got an inundation, and you know, add 6, 7, 8,000 years, you know, there's probably harder to find. But, you know, the persuasive argument I got from the Wampanoags was, well, you know, we used to live out there, and the water came up, so we moved back. And this is how far we've come so far. I mean, there's a lot to be said for that, especially on the shelf. Now, it may be different when you're in areas which were never pre-inundation. But I think we're taking a strong look at that as we talk, particularly with indigenous peoples, about their heritage and what they know in their oral traditions and their ken, whether it's tribal or Native Hawaiians, about what it was like 6,000, 7,000 years ago. And so we're trying to really look at that much more broadly as we look at it. We do deal with stuff, even if it's stuff that's belief-driven. So that's a limitation on our part. But there's a whole lot more potential out there than just shipwrecks. Love them though I do.
Well, and it comes back to a certain question for you lawyers, which is, as an agency manager, trained as an archaeologist, do I absolutely have to have empirical, solid evidence, as BOEM is seeking, and others are, that here's a site, here's a preserved organic deposit, here's clay, here's stone monuments, here's this or that? Or can I intuitively, because of oral tradition that's been passed on, say, you know what? The absence of something there that I've got a photograph of doesn't mean that I can't manage this responsibly and sensitively and deal with it as, you know, a submerged prehistoric landscape, and for Western science TBD, but traditionally it's there. I mean, do I have the authority to do that?
I think you can. You know, what about, you know, there was a Ninth Circuit case years ago, Pueblo Sandia, where you had a parking lot. Whoever thought a parking lot was anything of importance? Turned out there were traditional dances that occurred there.
Mm-hmm.
You couldn't see that, but you heard about it.
Right.
And eventually there's a connection. So you have intangible cultural properties. If you've got that, you can show a connection. I don't see any reason why, you know, you couldn't defend a case if somebody wanted to say that this is important and significant, even if you can't see it.
And that's why, I mean, we're moving away from calling them traditional cultural properties and calling them the alternative name, which is in the past literature of traditional cultural places. Sometimes a place has significance to a group or groups of people simply because of their belief systems. Is that any less important than stuff?
Exactly. Good.
So I want to take that lead that you just gave me a minute ago. We've been enjoying fabulous pictures of underwater stuff. Tomorrow I'm headed to Sturgeon Bay where I grew up, and we've seen a number of my friends, but I don't see any shoreside structures. And I want to make a plea for a moment with the assembled brain trust we have, that we stop looking at our feet and we start looking at what's in front of us and look at what I'm going to, for lack of a better word, call contemporary historical archaeology. I mean, we have folks like Ralph Stanley on Mount Desert Island in Maine who's put up his boat shop of years and years and years and years on the market because he's retiring. Who's going to go out and do the folk life and the documentation of that boat shop before it changes hands and we lose that piece of maritime cultural landscape and it gets morphed? You know, where I grew up in Sturgeon Bay, Peterson Builders is no more. It's grass and condos. Latham Smith Shipbuilding is no more. It's below what's now actively Bay Ship. A month ago, Palmer Johnson's, which has been a custom yacht builder in Sturgeon Bay for years and years and years, 1 month ago announced that it's stopped American production and there's a few things that are going to be built in Europe. I'm going up tomorrow because I'm going into their shops to photograph how it was when the guys walked out of their shop a month ago. And there's, you know, shoreside structures like the Tacoma wheat warehouses built by the Great Northern Railroad are heavily underrepresented on the National Register. The presentation yesterday about the fish shacks and the rude structures of the Maritime coast, you know, I think the SHPO's offices and the folks at the National Register need to think about, you know, how do we look up besides what's just below?
Good point. We have about one more minute. Any last thoughts? Yes, Doug.
Jorn Danker, the premier underwater archaeologist for Denmark, has indicated to us that anaerobic environments preserve quite well.
Yes.
And that I think we need to be looking for those. We need to be developing and encouraging the electronic devices and procedures that can see through the surface sediments into what is below, and that belief system is evidence as well as physical evidence is evidence, and we should be dealing with both of those and giving them a strong place in what we protect that is going to be in a non-oxygenated anaerobic environment.
Excellent point. I was just in Denmark 2 weeks ago. The National Museum, the entire ground floor filled with all of the evidence they're getting from their submerged sites.